Very good. We're giving everyone an impossible task because we gave them 5 minutes to do the history, the entirety of the Middle East. But now you'll have your chance to have a say, and you'll have even less time. So let's keep it nice and brisk, and we'll try and get through as many people as possible. Right, that microphone, give it to the lady there.
Anne-Elisabeth said that that it should be up to the powers of the region to resolve the conflict. Is that contradicted in any way by the current, what appears to be siding with Israel in terms of the outcome of wanting Israel to win in the conflict as a civilizational question? So I think that's a bit confusing at the moment.
Trump seems to associate himself very much with Qatar. Qatar is associated in many people's minds very much with the Muslim Brotherhood, which must have an agenda. Now it has a big agenda. Is any of the panel worried about any of that?
Yeah, I don't buy this idea at all that Israel is a regional superpower, although it's said very often. And I think people have that impression because of the symbolic importance of Israel and because it's fighting a kind of existential war. So it has to be very ruthless towards its opponents. But if you look at the objective criteria, Israel in many ways is very weak. Population about 10 million, of whom about 7 million are Jewish, and over 1 million in the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community don't even serve in the army. If you look at the economy, last time I looked, it was about 50th in the world. Admittedly, it has a kind of a high-tech sector, but very small. Land area, about the same size as Wales or New Jersey. Even militarily, contrary to what people keep on saying, Israel is not militarily the strongest power in the region. The strongest power in the region, without any doubt, if you look at the objective criteria, is Turkey. And if there's anything close to a regional hegemon, although I take Tim's point that, there's no clear regional hegemon, it is Turkey, because by all of those criteria, economic, political, demographic, that is the most powerful country in the region. And just finally, if you look at what Israeli security analysts are saying, although they're not saying it very loud, but if you look at what they're saying in their kind of more internal documents, they're very concerned about potential conflict with Turkey, particularly because Erdogan, the president, is becoming more and more anti-Israeli in his rhetoric. So if there's one thing I would take out of this discussion, it's really, I would say, focus more on Turkey if you want to understand the broader picture in relation to the Middle East.
Yeah, mine's a very short point to the panel. What, if any, does the Arab League bring to the party?
The question is, who will control the Middle East? And there seems to be an unspoken assumption that it's going to be some government or the other. And I'm wondering if you might be overlooking something. Specifically, I'm looking at the water crisis in Iran and wondering if maybe climate change is going to have a bigger impact than anything we humans do. Thank you.
Nice question. Okay, let's get some quick responses. Again, with the spirit of keeping it brief, let's just run down the table starting with Ralph.
All right, very quick. I'm going 30 seconds. I'm going to tell you the most boring thing you've ever heard. So please bear with me for a second. So China is the world's largest coal consumption country. They use a process that was developed with the usual German genius, the so-called Fischer-Tropsch process. And what this does is it's a process by which you can turn coal into liquid fuel. If you look at the amount of coal China is using for this process, that would make them, the coal they use would make them the second largest consumer of coal after, China again. And my point that I'm making with this is that currently what props up the Iranian regime, whatever you think of it, right? I'm not making here any political point, is China buying their oil. Once China reaches independence, they no longer care about Iran. So the big problem is, and you will see this all over the region, I think this is also the reason why Trump could get everybody on the table. The big fear in the Arab states, and Turkey, because of its geography, might be a different story. The big fear of the Arab nations is that they become irrelevant. We are still all, as am I, fascinated with the Middle East because this is something historically we have learned over the past, 9/11, the oil embargo in the 70s. So it became like a very, very important part of our lives. But this is fading at the moment because what most Arab countries, again, it's not an indictment of the people, it's just a fact. What they bring to the table is resource richness. But unfortunately, or fortunately for us, the world is very rich in resources. So their dominant role is diminishing. OPEC, it's still nice for them to meet and have fancy dinners, but they don't play the kind of role they played in the past. And you will see this all over the region. So I think this is a very, very important point. So, yeah, that's it, basically.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I really would like to underline how right Ralph is. That's the most important thing, is they have less leverage than they used to have. Should the West stay out or go in? The West has got in many times with extremely strange results. So, to the very least, let's look at the means that the West has to go into the Middle East, wherever the conflict is, and it's got to have something that actually Colin Powell theorized, but he was not the first one. Overwhelming force on a specific area, not generalize this, and sort of target and pinpoint. I think there is a case.
Sorry, if I can say, because the sharp edge of the question,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
was if we're against Western intervention in the region, how do we defend supporting Israel?
If, first of all, Israel is indigenous to the region, but second, if we talk about, for instance, targeting the Houthis are essentially have changed the cost of almost half the world's shipping. They attack Western commercial ships in the Red Sea all the time. There is a perfect, decent case to be made for saying some targeting of the Houthis. Some of it was done by the Israelis, but Western intervention is something that could be understood by the rules of conventional war because they are attacking. And it might sort of encourager les autres. That would be a reason. I don't believe in lots of intervention. We've seen. I was in favor of the Iraq War in 2001 too, and I was wrong. And it's I was not in charge of deciding anything, but you remember how these things first of all start, look like they're working, and then the execution is terrible. And what you mentioned about disbanding the Iraqi army was essential. What the Iraqi army was at the time, it was 1 million people who were supporting their families. It was a part of the social welfare network of Iraq. And when you destroy it, you destroy ties, you destroy structures, and you essentially destroy parts of the economy. So it's very complex. It's very nice to look after the fact and say that shouldn't have been like that. But I'm for limited intervention and letting the locals sort of decide how they want to do it.
Great, very good. Nick?
Yes, well, unlike many civil servants, I tend to define issues in terms of results rather than inputs. And on the point about is Israel a regional superpower or not, I have to say on the basis of results over the last 12 years, I would say they definitely are a regional superpower and are having a disproportionate impact. On Turkey, yeah, I mean, Turkey is a big player. I mean, you might argue about whether Turkey is more European or more Middle Eastern, but they, I think, in a way, their intervention, as far as I understand it, is most directly focused on how to manage their Kurdish issue, which is a major source of instability and will continue to be a source of instability in that part of the Middle East. I think that's it from me.
Yeah, very useful. Chris?
There was a load of stuff about Turkey in the speaking notes that I lost, so I'm very glad that the gentleman in the back brought it up. This moment in which Iran is on the back foot and more absent from various theatres than it was over the last few years, it creates this gap for groups that have been put to one side. So the Lebanese Sunnis, for example, are one. Elements of the Sunni coalition in Iraq are another, and we're already seeing it playing out in a big way in Syria. There is a gap for a sort of Sunni revanchement, and Turkey is going to be absolutely critical in how that plays out. And the West and the United States has really disregarded the Turkish relationship. Turkey's had a number of serious problems, mainly as a result of catastrophic decisions taken in Washington. And Trump really needs to rebuild that relationship as best he can. I think the thing about Israel, I don't think there's such thing as a regional superpower. A superpower is a global role. Israel is a regional power and a very effective one. But the fact that it doesn't have to think and behave like a global superpower, maintaining that kind of network of interests and whatever, gives it this freedom of action to behave more decisively than a superpower can at sometimes. About the Arab League, I think it would be perfectly possible to write a really comprehensive paper about this situation in the Middle East without mentioning it once. I think that there was a time about 40 or 50 years ago when it was an extremely important forum, and it's just not anymore. There's far too many countries in it for it to be anything more than a bore fest. And I think OPEC's going down the same route as well, to be honest.
Thanks, Chris. Tim?
I think Daniel's right at the back. Israel shouldn't even be considered as a regional hegemon because it doesn't actually have those aspirations. Its simple objective is to survive, to persist, That's what's shaping and determining its actions. And I think that differs from some of the other regional actors who have slightly more aggrandizing approach to the region. Turkey is a key player, is possibly potentially the most powerful of the regional or near regional actors. But it is also considerably hamstrung. The Kurdish issue is key. People sometimes forget, because there's a lot of focus on the Palestine question, but the Kurds are the largest people without a state in the entire world. There's 20 million Kurds spread over 4 nations, spread over Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. And it's a significant question which really doesn't get the attention it should do. Interestingly, of course, Turkey is in the process, it seems, of coming to some kind of rapprochement with the Kurdish Workers' Party, who have, I think they've basically put down their arms. I think people look at me.
You're telling you're the expert. Come on,
it's happening, right? So the extent to which Turkey can resolve some of its Kurdish problems will perhaps free it up to continue to expand its influence and power in Syria, where it has made considerably inroads, largely through Syria's new semi-ruler, because to be honest, Syria is also still a bit of a patchwork of territories which are under various groups' control, not least, of course, the Syrian Kurds, who control a significant portion of Syria, which they will definitely want to keep. And without wanting to sound too optimistic, I always think Iran is still the key to the region, because of the considerable popular unrest in Iran, certainly over the past, I would say, 5, 6, 7 years. There was, significant strikes and protests amongst working class areas of Iran, which had traditionally been quite, stalwart in their support for the Iranian regime. There was, of course, the women life freedom protests. When was that? About 2 or 3 years ago. So there's significant pushback, I think, in Iranian civil society against an effectively Islamic regime. So I think there is hope there. Although I think at the same time, after the Israel-Iran conflagration, the Iranian regime seems a little bit more empowered. But I do think Iran is the key, not least because that Ayatollah he's not got long left. And the question of succession will open up potentially open up possibilities for a new sort of political settlement in Iran.
Okay, I'll set out that Chris just respond briefly on water, and then
we forgot that really important question about water. Actually, I'd look, rather than Iran on that, I'd look at what Turkey's doing, and Turkey's building all these hydroelectric power stations and doing incredible thing to the Tigris, diverting it and cutting it down, and that's happening with a few other rivers. So it's actually rather than climate change, it's the attempt to address climate change is the really big issue, and people building hydroelectric power stations. That's a major factor to look at, even more so than the weather.
Okay, great. Let's have some more questions, comments.
A long time ago, I was an advisor to the Palestinian Authority, and Arafat was still alive. So I may not be completely objective with my understanding, but please don't misunderstand me. I think that asking Arafat whether he would accept a certain treaty or not would be like asking Martin McGuinness for the solution to Northern Ireland. So we knew that after the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement and there was a referendum in Ireland, the overwhelming majority of people in Ireland supported the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that the same would be true in Palestine. Were there to be an opportunity for the Palestinians to have a referendum on a 2-state solution. That's my gut feeling, because that was the feeling I got when I lived in Jerusalem and Ramallah 20 years ago. Maybe things have changed. Thank you.
Two questions. You kind of alluded to it, but you haven't really spoken about any of the specifics of it. What form does American influence take in the Middle East at the moment? I mean, directly. So even within Israel, because to me, it seemed like the main reason that Israel got to the point of doing a deal was because they'd more or less destroyed Hamas militarily. So first question there, what forms, kind of concretely, how does American influence manifest itself in the Middle East at the moment? And in relation to, I think it's sort of partly answers that question as well, because if Hamas is still playing a part, then the 2-state solution seems like a good way to beat Israel around the head and not much else.
From Israel, I'm going to speak about their God, the all the covenants, the glory, the law, the temple, the Messiah, the apostles, the disciples, everything comes. The whole Judeo-Christian tradition comes from the Jewish people originally. So whether there be a superpower or not is not it's up to God. He is the superpower in the area, and he will, you know, his plans will come to pass, and he won't forsake his people.
Well, let's try and figure out what those plans are. Okay, does anyone want to get in? Okay, because I think we're going to ask the panel to address directly the peace deal next. But yeah, you go ahead.
Somebody's already asked this, but what is the end game of Qatar? Why and what's their deal with sponsoring Islamism abroad?
The question was, what's Qatar's end game?
What's the importance of the Western popular movements in relation to the Middle East? What impact do the Western popular movements have in the Middle East in their support for the Palestinian cause? And how destabilizing is that, or how influential is it, or is it not really?
Okay, nice question. There's the gentleman in front of you, then I'll come back to the panel.
As somebody who doesn't know much about it and been very, very well informed today, I can see 4 possible ways that this ends. 1, an overwhelming victory, like World War II. Somebody wins, somebody loses convincingly. The second scenario might be just sheer exhaustion. Everybody is exhausted. The third is an intervention by the equivalent of a British mandate or Ottoman Empire equivalent of the time. And the fourth is a possibility that both sides get a Mandela de Klerk type, where you have a personal chemistry by two extraordinary individuals. None of them seem to be on the cards now, but is there any prospect of any of those 4 coming to fruition?
Okay, good. Let's hear back from the panel. Same order. Ralph, do you want to address some of those?
I mean, one thing that barely gets addressed in this debate is we discuss this very often from our specific angle and from our own lived experience. I guess that's the saying. But if you look at the demographics of Gaza, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the median age or the average age is somewhere between 19 and 21-year-old. They are predominantly male, so there is a male overhang, and I guess everyone in the audience knows this. Hang around with a group of young men in their late teens or early 20s. Those are by default not the most rational people. But that's the majority population in the Palestinian territories, and it's also a phenomenon you have all over the area. And again, that's not an indictment of young men. Good for them that they have them. But my fear is, if the economic model in the region should fail, these people are not going to stay. So from a European perspective, my point is always, what happens if they start to move? What happens if you have a migration wave that is not just sub-Saharan African, but then also North African and Middle Eastern in nature? And again, to be very clear, I'm not making an emotional argument here. I understand if the people want to move. I also would like to live a better life if whenever I have the chance. But this is something that will be very difficult for Europe to manage. And it will be primarily a European problem because the Americans are far, far away. So the question about what kind of interventionism, the Americans will intervene when they see it in their interest, and they will walk away when they see that in their interest. There's a famous quote by Bernard Lewis, who died recently, but I think there have not been many British people who know the Middle East as well as he did. And he said the big problem with the United States is they're seen as harmless as an enemy and treacherous as a friend. And I think that is not entirely wrong. But they can afford to do this because, as I said, they have 2 oceans that protect them. Europe doesn't have this luxury. So on the long run, I think the Middle East will be a problem to manage, both from their perspective and our perspective, because, as I said, I think Europe is not going to be able to survive a wave or several additional migration waves as we had in the past. So this is why it will remain relevant. So they need to succeed for us to survive. So that's the best way to look at it.
Okay, several points. I would say to the lady who said God is the superpower that God by definition is unknowable, and may he stay that way. In terms of the influence of Western demonstrations and Western activism pro-Palestine, I'd like to, it depends who it affects and how. It certainly, as I said before, it does affect Western politicians because they see constituencies that are going another way, and they see parents who think they want peace at home. It's unglorious, but it's something that is not helping Israeli foreign policy and Israelis' place. Other than that, just look at it, but they've looked at somebody like Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg, like all of the people of the various flotillas who sailed in the beautiful late summer Mediterranean to sort of go and demonstrate in front of the coast of Israel and Gaza, they see that every single flag, every single scarf, every single badge they're wearing has a map of Palestine, which is the entire state of Israel and Cisjordan and Gaza. And therefore, what that means is the eradication of Israel. And these young people are not as sophisticated as diplomats. And they usually express that as well. They say Israel is a colonial power. The Jews should be sent back home. Define home is an interesting point. But anyway, so they have disqualified themselves in the view of the Israeli public opinion by and large, and even anti-Netanyahu left-wing opinion in Israel that wants a two-state solution. They don't take this seriously, and they have disqualified themselves at home and as demonstrators in the rest of the world for America, and America is still a superpower. That was one point. And the last thing about Turkey. In Project 2025, which is a kind of blueprint, it's not a real sort of, we have a plan and we're going to follow it, but it's a blueprint that was put together by the Heritage Foundation in the 4 years between when Trump lost the election in 2020 and now. And it's got a whole chapter on creating a Turkic alliance and that would involve places like Turkey, of course, Azerbaijan, and all the way to all the stands in Central Asia. And that is one of the myriad directions that Americans are looking at, people in think tanks, we are trying to sort of organize something that we're not going to make massive requirements about democracy, but we're certainly saying you could be, our place of choice to counteract the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese. You could be building stuff. There's no reason why you couldn't. And there's a complicated diplomatic, economic outreach. And I've no idea how much military, but all the rest that was stressed out in presentations that I've seen. So this might be one way of, I won't say neutralizing Turkey, but it's one way of showing the Turkish government that there's another way of interest of getting something that is good in a country where inflation is terrible, where the economy is not doing very well because people who invest don't like investing in dictatorships, and sort of bringing Turkey back into the way of economic interest and regional interest. I don't know where that's going, but it's something that is very much being worked on, and it would be an interesting way for the future. And I think that is more or less it.
Yeah, that covers it for now. Right, Nick.
Yeah, there was a question about why is the US so heavily engaged? Well, the US and the West generally has been heavily engaged, particularly in the Gulf, because of money, because of oil. And I think there's a sort of a deal that goes on, which is money in return for protection. So traditionally, the Brits provided a degree of sort of military protection. I think Ralph made the point earlier on that whether you're looking at the UAE or Qatar, they haven't really got the wherewithal to defend themselves. So they're quite interested. I think the US's biggest base in the region is in Qatar. So it's about protection. And there was another point, and I think also that as Ralph said, when the oil no longer becomes as economically potent as it once was, it'll pose interesting question marks for the region. And the other thing in terms of US engagement, I think Europe is pretty much run out of puff. We just haven't got the money or the wherewithal. Though Europeans are acutely concerned about this and always have been, because the Israel-Palestine problem in particular has a way of manifesting itself. I was on a desk when Pan Am 103 went down, for example. So, we can't ignore it. And I think Trump will expect the Europeans to stick their hands in their pockets to support the 20-point plan, assuming it gets ahead of steam. I think also in terms of the why can't we just get decent people to finally get this problem sorted out? I think people have put in enormous amounts of work over the last 30, 35, 40 years in terms of trying to get both sides to a deal. I can't tell you how much work has gone into it. And at the end of the day, one side or the other walks away. And if you do commit, someone from your own side is pretty likely to kill you. That's a bit of a disincentive, frankly. And finally, I asked that lady, I think maybe God is the only answer. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Chris?
Gentleman on the front row, your question, the role of the United States, America's position and its influence in this comes from the fact that it's the only credible actor in the world that can provide an insurance policy that sits behind any agreement like this. The fact that they underwrite it, and they're the only country that can actually deliver consequences and offer some recourse in the case of sort of somebody entering into an agreement like that in bad faith. I think you can see this in the way that Trump approaches a lot of these. The way that he approaches negotiations, you can definitely see it in terms of how he's tried to handle Ukraine, in that he seems to want to demoralize and take the sort of the questions of the rights and wrongs out of the issue, and simply look at either side as parties that have. How do you jig things so that each party has something more to gain by sitting and engaging in negotiations than by continuing on the fight? I think that the approach can be effective, as we've seen. I think that there are definitely limits in terms of, because that's just not how people approach these things. They think in terms of the morality and the rights and wrongs, that their side is right. But that's how he tries to go about it. Qatar, I have to say, and I know that I don't trust them at all, and they are definitely trying to spread all sorts of dangerous ideologies. I'm slightly unconvinced that they sort of have the potential to sort of play a terribly spoiling role. I think it surely not beyond the wit of man to box them in institutionally, sort of between the Americans and the rest of the GCC, as we've seen, and I think that they have sort of wound their necks in a little bit since Trump got back into office. And clearly, I think that the role that they have played is sort of somewhere where people from organizations like the Taliban and Hamas can sort of. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you're going to need to talk to somebody who's sort of not in a cave underground with all their communications switched off. And Hamas, sort of, Qatar plays a sort of, it's a place where those people can sort of sit in some degree of security, and they're clearly doing so at the behest of the US, and I think in Hamas's case, probably Israel as well.
And they gave Trump a 747. I mean, that must count.
It's pretty useful.
Very good. Tim, and then we'll come back out for just some last comments, and then I'll get the panel to reflect, I think, on the piece too, as I said.
Yeah, no, it's clearly not beyond the wit of Qatar's neighbours to try to rein it in. It was the blockade in 2020, where basically all land access to Qatar was shut off, power as well. It's not power, but it was significantly isolated. So it already happens. So I wouldn't almost get too hung up on Qatar. I would get hung up on the curious sort of Western support for Palestine, which isn't quite what it seems exactly. I think it's more born of this kind of weird, unholy kind of Islamist progressive alliance, which rests ultimately on this kind of shared loathing of the West, shared loathing and rejection of modernity, and all associated values and principles. And of course, that idea of that kind of idea of modernity they see embodied in Israel, which they loathe with an intensity which I've frankly been grimly astonished by. But that Western support for Palestine, which manifests itself, as Elizabeth said, through basically pressure exerted on politicians who respond likewise by effectively, in certainly Britain's case, recognising a Palestinian state, France as well, Canada. It doesn't just manifest itself in terms of that kind of explicit political action. There is now just an intensification of that already existing so-called boycott and divestment, BDS, boycott, divestment, and what was the S? Sanctions. Christ, I've heard it. Sanctions bit, yeah. But now it's intensified. It's not even, it doesn't have to be done under the BDS banner. There is just now, I think, a broad Western cultural political move to isolate and treat Israel as a kind of pariah state. You have Hollywood celebrities who swear not to work with any kind of Israeli kind of actor film production company. You'll see that attempt to kind of make sure that Israel is excluded from sports, Eurovision. It sounds trivial, but it's just all-encompassing attempt to ensure that Israel is treated as a kind of nation and actually seen as like an evil nation apart from other nations. It's treated to a standard that no other nation in the history of the world has ever been treated. And I think that is one of the most worrying aspects of the current situation. And it's worth bearing in mind, therefore, that not only does that drag the West back into Middle Eastern politics, it also drags Middle Eastern politics into the West. And I think that's what we're seeing playing out right now.
Very good. Right. Coming out, last round of questions. Any? Okay.
Just to say like a couple of things about how Israel's being treated. I think we need to remember that Israel was created out of Zionism, and Zionism was created out of anti-Semitism itself. It was more about the Jews need somewhere to live, but that can't be my own backyard. And I feel like Israel has felt that, and the Jews have felt that, and we still treat Israel that way. We don't want them to come over here for whatever reason it was back 100 years ago, and they feel everyone hates us and we don't care. And that's what Netanyahu is positing as his ideals, and that's why he has held support for quite so long.
Very good. Pass that one just in front of you to this lady.
I'd just like to try out a theory. We're talking about the balance of power in the Middle East, and I'm wondering whether there's a possibility of this becoming an irrelevant subject in terms of Islamism and the global crisis of mass migration to the West. And I'm worried that Ayaan says that Islam needs a reformation. Christianity had a reformation in the 18th century, which brought in coincided with the Enlightenment, which was about reason and freedom and progress. And I fear that that was the objective conditions then that led to that caused that kind of a reformation. But I'm worried that it seems to me that Islam is a static religion with no sense of time. Judaism and Christianity both include the concept of reinterpreting the scriptures in light of new experiences. But in Islam, the Prophet's words are only there, as I understand it, to be discovered, not interpreted. And good Muslims fit into democracy by going against the teachings of Islam. And I'm worried that Islam is having a reformation now, but it's going in the wrong direction. So please, can somebody disabuse me of this? Because I'm more and more coming to the conclusion that Islamism and Islam are basically the same thing. And when I look at the hatred of Jews, the hatred of Israel, I find it impossible to extricate or to disentangle anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. I think today they are virtually the same.
Okay.
I'm super interested in thoughts of the rise of influence of Turkey. My family background's like Armenian, and I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel has any thoughts on what happens to like the fringe sort of neighbors such as Armenia in the Caucasus if Turkey does succeed in becoming a more of a power.
The two-state solution has been talked about for the Holy Lands. I think there's and I'm not sure how workable that is with so many settlers. I think about 700,000 living in the West Bank. So another solution, which I'd like the panel to talk about, is the potential of a one state where everyone. So I think a major issue there for many years has been the apartheid system that exists in the Holy Lands. And so if we do away with apartheid and make everybody who regards the Holy Lands as home, which are Jews, Palestinians and Bedouins and other smaller groups, do away with the inequality, we end up with one nation where everybody learns to live at peace with one another. And just another slight point, I just like to wonder where Tony Blair fits in. I've been hearing that he's actually behind it. Trump has picked
hopefully
up
nowhere
the plan. Well, I've heard that Tony Blair is the person behind the 20-point plan that Trump has now fronted. That's what I've heard.
Hi, so you briefly touched on the nuclear side of it and nuclear armament. I was wondering if you could turn to that as an area of concern and if that's something that is guaranteeing power to areas like Iran versus Israel, and if that's going to have an area of concern for the subsequent dealings and subsequent stability of the region.
Some critics talk about really the Gazan war in Palestine as a sideshow, and that the forces of Islam and Islamicism duking it out between the Sunnis and the Shias is the real drama that's playing out in the Middle East, and that the West Bank issue, two-state, whatever, is just a sideshow and a cipher for much bigger forces, which does coincide with some of the speakers on the panel. How far do you think that's true?
Okay, very good. Okay, I think it's this gentleman is the last person who wants to speak. I'm going to then return to the panel in the order that they spoke originally. I'm going to give them a little bit more time to, one, answer some question, and then two, touch on what their take is on the peace plan and what the prospects are for peace, at least in Gaza, right? So, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful panel. Following on from the Reformation point, are the panel seeing any movement towards secularization? I mean, there was a comment on the kind of age of the general populace. In most parts of the world, younger people tend to become less religious and more secular. Are you seeing that? And what do you see, if that is true, what impact might that have? Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks for some wonderful contributions. Let's now run over. So, as I say, order in which we spoke, answer a couple of questions, and then the thing that, as I say, somehow hasn't really actually come out, but the question of the peace plan. But Ralph.
Very quick, I start with the last question, which is an excellent one. Yes, it's true that young people tend to be less religious, but it also is true that they tend to be more radical. So if we look at this from a purely religious perspective, I would fully agree. But if we look at particularly Islam also as a political, ideological movement, you can also have the opposite effect. And that's, I would say, throughout history, we see this with almost every ideological movement, from fascism to communism to Nazism. Usually it was very appealing to young men. Right, wokeness, I'm not going to go into it, is slightly different. That is, I would argue, more a feminine young female movement, but that's neither here nor there. But young people are not generally, also not young people at universities, are not generally less susceptible to ideologies. I would say they are more so. One last quick point, which I think is the biggest obstacle to peace in the Israel-Palestine conflict. There's a story we don't talk about enough. You can hear from my accent that my mother tongue is German. We don't talk often about the fact that 6 million Germans have been driven out of their ancient lands in 1945. That problem was solved in 1952 for the very reason because there was no international community and there was no United Nations. Nothing against the United Nations, but the Palestinians have been the most wrecked people on planet Earth, not due to their own fault, but because they have been taken care of by some of the worst international organizations possible. They have been frozen in time. They have been frozen in conditions that started in 1948. And let me be very clear, there's a lot that happened was not fair, was unjust, completely agree. But unfortunately, as everybody in this room knows, history is not just and it is not fair. God might be, history unfortunately is not. And this is, I think, the big question for the future. The biggest thing for this peace process to be successful is if we find a way for the people in the region to take their fate into their own hand, but in every respect, because then they have no choice. Then they have to become more rational, right? Because if you're not on the teeth of some international organization, but you have to be responsible for your own economic and social outcome, you just have much less time to be radicalized and follow in the ideological footsteps of the past. But if this is going to happen, remains to be seen.
Thanks, Ralph. Chris.
So just addressing a couple a few people have made about an Islamic Reformation, Sunni Shias, and secularization. I'm going to go back to Iraq again. I think the experience of the 1990s of incredible sanctions that were put on, extremely cruel sanctions that were imposed on Iraq at that time, and the entire country just sort of turned in on itself, and it led to this wave of religiosity, which then manifested itself in this sort of schism between Sunnis and Shia. I think that for a time looked like it was going to be the defining issue of the era. In Iraq, it really is going away. I think sort of there's more of a sort of rivalry, is sort of intra-Shia rivalry. People are going back to the way it used to be, where you just literally in places like Baghdad, and I think this is to some extent happening in Beirut as well. People are going back to just not knowing whether their neighbors are Sunnis or Shias. So I think that is becoming less of an issue. I think that there's a wave of the wave of religiosity that emerged in the Middle East from the late 70s onwards was driven by young people. I think that my feeling in places like Iraq, I don't know about Syria. To some extent, places like Saudi Arabia, it feels like it's backing off a bit, but I think that that's probably the result of political and economic circumstances, and it could turn on a sixpence. And yeah, the lady about the clock, who I do share the skepticism about an Islamic Reformation. I think it would probably end up looking more like the one that Christianity had in the 16th century than the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And I think that could be jolly bad news for everybody. One last point, I'm going to step in and just defend the comment made by the gentleman up in the gallery, even though I haven't yet fully forgiven him for mistaking me for Graham Linehan yesterday. Come on. I think everybody, it got a bit of a laugh. It got a bit of a laugh, but I think that everybody massively underestimates the extent to which Tony Blair is plugged into Trump world. And I genuinely think that he might have more influence over it than any of us would like to think about. So it really wouldn't surprise me to see him popping up and give him a chance.
Okay, let me tell you a story about Tony Blair. In May 2007, Tony Blair decided to get out of Dodge before the global economy blew up and decided he'd pay us a courtesy visit to say goodbye and farewell and thanks for all the fish. And so we lived in a compound that had Bren gun towers and duck and cover shelters and radar alerts when rockets and mortars came in. And the day before Tony Blair was due to arrive, there was... I got a call from the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq. I went round and he was on a jogging machine, slightly sweaty. And he said, "I'm terribly sorry to have to tell you that the president has let slip to the Iranians that your prime minister is coming tomorrow." So I duly reported this to the powers that be. And I was reassured that Tony Blair would be coming the following day. And at exactly 10:30 the following day, when we were all standing with cups of tea and cucumber sandwiches, poised for the arrival of Tony Blair's helicopter, there was an almighty explosion in the compound of the embassy. And as I said earlier on, not one but two of my cars got blown up, and they were armoured vehicles as well. So to be fair to Tony Blair, he did turn up, and I think it was probably about 3 hours later, and it was probably a reminder to him of kind of what he'd unleashed on the rest of us. Whether he is the right pick to run the Palestine Oversight Board, I'm not so sure. Just to address a couple of the points that have been raised, I mean, on the kind of idea of do we now go for a kind of a one-state solution? I mean, I think it's a very good question, because the logical conclusion of the Israeli position right now is that there can't be a two-state solution, so there has to be a one-state solution according to their logic. How that will work, I have no idea. I mean, what I would say about Israel is I find it deeply disturbing, to be honest, the degree of sort of hatred, because as far as I can see, Israel is the only genuine democracy in the Middle East. There are some pretty wacky parties there who are distorting the way that Israeli policy is operating on the ground, and there are some things that Israel does which are frankly really unpleasant. But the fact of the matter is that they are a democracy, and I think if organizations who shoot their rivals in the streets and execute their rivals in the streets are, frankly, the model for us to follow, given the rather unfortunate habit of this issue extending itself onto our streets, that I think is really rather a grim prospect for all of us. So I hope that. So I'll stop there.
Very good, Jen. Very good. So it's Anne. Thank you, Anne-Elisabeth, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Several things, but I would like first to answer the gentleman who talked about apartheid with such conviction. And I would like to know if this gentleman has been to South Africa under apartheid and has been to Israel, because there are a few differences in housing, in jobs, in access to practically anything. You have ministers who are Druze and Arab, and I'm not sure there's a Bedouin, but you have Bedouin generals. You have lots of Druze generals. You've got people not only of Arab, Christian or Muslim descent winning various Israeli pop television contests, but even Filipino immigrants. And it is about the least apartheidy country I've seen in my life. You have beaches. You have beaches in Israel where you've got the card of, the mosaic of ways to dress, which has become illegal in France, my own country. So by and large, no, I don't think it's an apartheid country. I have met lots of Arabs who have decided that, yes, this is a flawed country. They disagree with it. They're members of the Knesset, and still they like the fact that they have a working democracy. And their sort of eagerness to be assassinated means that they do not always say it as loudly as they do publicly, but they still believe it. And you just go to the Knesset and see how they deal with their Israeli colleagues. And no, this is not apartheid. They have the jobs, they have everything. And I'm very surprised that you have been buying into this. But that is part of using the word apartheid or genocide, because you've got to tar Israel with the kind of sins that have been committed against people in the name of racism and against, indeed, Jews in the name of anti-Semitism, which is racism. I think you asked a very good question about the whole Turkic sort of outreach, Turkic countries, and you quite rightly named the problems with the Azeris and the Armenians, because the things that were perpetrated on the 7th of October in Israel were also perpetrated by the Azeri military on the Armenians when they took back Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm not going to go into the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, but unfortunately, these things are now being videoed. So I've seen videos, and honestly, there's not much to differentiate one from the other. There were no babies, but that's about all I can say. So it is a problem. It is also known that because, for various reasons, and mostly that there's a 20% minority of Azeris in the north of Iran. The Israelis have been extremely reluctant to express themselves about this, because they held the Azeris in northern Iran on the old Middle Eastern thing that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least for the moment. I don't know how that goes. It probably is something that can be worked out. I'm not going to recommend the Israeli regime to many people for various reasons. That one, especially, honestly, the videos were sickening. But it is something that, unlike other issues in the Middle East, probably can be discussed over time in a more civilized manner than the grandstanding sort of buttressed by Westerners who don't know much in the streets of our various countries in the region. I don't know how far it will go. I don't know whether it can be achieved. And that's my answer on it. That's about it.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne-Elisabeth. Tim.
I think after the inevitable nuclear war, which is surely coming, probably starting in the Middle East, I think the only thing that would be left or surviving will be cockroaches and Tony Blair. I think the man really is the political turd that won't flush, just floating around. Geopolitics, they're great unflushable. I think it's probably worth trying to allay some fears about Islam as a kind of broad religion followed by, 2.5 billion people. The largest Muslim majority countries, of course, in Southeast Asia. There are problems. I think there are problems in Malaysia, of course, at the moment. But you can see that it doesn't necessarily. You don't necessarily have to have a Muslim majority country, which is automatically tending towards kind of oppressive authoritarianism. And so I do think it's pretty worth bearing that in mind. Having said all that, I do think Islamism is a problem, and we do need to distinguish it to an extent from Islam. Of course, it derives from it to an extent, but it's also a very modern ideology. It's an ideology which emerges, as I said, in 1928, I think, in Egypt, and it emerges partially under the influence of anti-Western or deeply reactionary thinkers from the West and in the West. And some of their thoughts are taken up by Egyptian Muslim ideologues, which then creates the Muslim, who then found the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think the key thing to understand that it is as an ideology, it's fueled by its opposition to Western modernity. It emerges in the 20th century in opposition to Western modernity, and that's what gives it its force and continues to give its force. And actually, it means that when you get this turn against Western modernity on the progressive left, probably from about the 60s, 1970s onwards, you then get like an unholy dovetailing of these two ways of thinking, and a dovetailing of, on the one hand, an anti-Western Islamism, and on the other hand, an anti-Western progressivism. And unfortunately, as other forms of radicalism have mutated in the West, as they have moved away from traditional kind of working class politics, what you've had, I think, over the past 2 or 3 decades, and I know the French sociologist or sociologist of religion, Olivier Roy, makes this point. What you have is the Islamization of radicalization in the West, right? So the radical opposition to sort of the status quo in the West increasingly takes this kind of oddly sort of Islamist form. And we've seen that amongst kind of young jihadis who aren't particularly devout Muslims themselves. But what appeals to them is that kind of Islamist rejection of the Western way of life. So I think that's a massively important thing to bear in mind. It's a massively important thing to bear in mind because I think as much as there is a conflict being waged right now in the Middle East, I think the real conflict that we have to fight is at home here. I think there's a real culture war that we have to fight against the kind of deeply reactionary anti-Western strains of thought which have gained preeminence over the past 2 years.